Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our series of virtual speaker events. I'm Liz Niss, a longtime League member and recently elected president of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. In addition to our own League members joining us today, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Congregation Beth Am and the AAUW Palo Alto, as well as our sister leagues for publicizing today's event. Empowering voters and defending democracy is the #1 goal for the National League of Women Voters website. Toward this goal, the League was able to reach 10 million voters in 2018, and that number is continuing to rise. Defending democracy is the cornerstone of the League of Women Voters. For today's event, we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Larry Diamond, a leading contemporary scholar in the field of democracy studies. Dr. Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where for more than 6 years, he directed FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's also a Stanford professor by courtesy of the political science and sociology departments. He's the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and he serves as senior consultant at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy. His research focuses on democratic trends and conditions around the world and on policies and reforms to defend and advance democracy. He's written numerous books on the topic of democracy, including China's Influence and American Interests and Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, which analyzes the challenges confronting liberal democracy in the US and all around the world at this potential hinge in history, and offers an agenda for strengthening and defending democracy at home and abroad. Dr. Diamond is in great demand as a speaker, both in the Bay Area, throughout our country and the world. Our topic for today is how to repair American democracy. American democracy is under more intense challenges than at any other time in the last half century. Two of the key challenges are interrelated: severe political polarization and partisan assaults on independence, integrity, and the fairness of the electoral process. Dr. Diamond will discuss some of the reforms that could help ensure the integrity of our elections and reduce the current influence of extremist elements in our political process. We will have a Q&A after the presentation. You're going to be muted throughout as we are on a webinar, and we ask that you put your questions in the chat. Myra Lesner, our Director of Events Committee, will do her best to get to all your questions. And now, with great pleasure, please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Diamond. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz, for the warm welcome. Thank you, Myra, for moderating the discussion and preparing the event. Thank you, Louise, and all the members of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. It's my honor to be with you. It's certainly a sobering time to be with you, and I'm not going to mince words and have to say here. If you'll permit me, I'm going to share my screen, and I think this lecture will be able to move more rapidly and be more effective if I can use these PowerPoint slides. Let me say there are two broad challenges that we face now for American democracy. One is to defend it against those that are placing partisan interests and political power over the democratic process itself. I'm sorry if I offend people. It's simply a descriptive fact that this challenge is coming, I think, virtually exclusively from one of our two great political parties. There are many Republicans who dissent from this project of preparedness to violate democratic norms in order to win and retain power. But the dominant wing of the Republican Party nationally, in the person of Donald Trump and those who support him, and alarmingly in a growing number of Republican-controlled states like Florida, Georgia, and Arizona, seem to be willing to violate basic democratic norms in order to swing the national elections toward the Republicans, even if they lose them, and swing state elections below the federal level as well. So we need to secure the democraticness of the vote, but there's a second challenge that stands before us, and that is to reform democracy to make it more governable and less polarized. And the political polarization is a separate challenge from the challenge of defending democracy against subversion, but the two are related. One reason why we're facing a growing assault on the integrity of the democratic process is because we are so polarized. Elections increasingly appear as an existential zero-sum struggle where one side fears if it loses, it will lose everything it values. There is declining trust between the two political parties and the two political camps. And this has really been degrading our democratic culture. I want to start briefly with securing democracy and securing the vote, the electoral process, and then I will come to the depolarization element. Of course, we know from the movement for women's suffrage and then the movement for voting rights for African Americans after it had been denied to them in the southern states for more than 8 decades following the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves and the passing of the amendment that guaranteed equal protection for all citizens. Now we're back to very basic issues of whether a politically dominant group in a state is going to be able to prevent, in this case, I think, not all African Americans or not all people of color or not all people who don't agree with them politically, but enough of them to ensure their electoral lockhold on the state and degrade and really erase the democratic character of elections. I note these principles for democratic elections. I do so as a scholar of democracy. You can read them on this slide, but I think they should be self-evident. If you want to have a democracy, you have to have free and fair elections to determine who rules. This requires electoral uncertainty, first of all, a willingness to accept defeat if you as a party, you as a candidate wind up losing a free and fair election, and a number of conditions to ensure that playing field is reasonably level, the election is administered without fear or favor or partisan advantage, and whoever has the most support wins. So neutral, nonpartisan electoral administration globally and over time has become a cardinal principle of democracy. The problem is that our political system and the way it is evolved by empowering in over 35 states elected secretaries of state to administer elections, with these being partisan officials who themselves have partisan interests, introduces a vulnerability in the process, which has been kind of inert and laying fallow for a long time, but it is there and is increasingly being activated as we become more polarized and as democratic norms increasingly erode. I think many of us also have long been troubled by the fact that in many states, I'm proud to say California is no longer among them, state legislatures with partisan interests and motivations can redraw electoral districts in a way to give them advantage. This is not illegal or unconstitutional, but it's a violation of democratic norms. More and more states are moving to nonpartisan commissions to draw electoral district boundaries, and I believe all should do so. I've written an op-ed recently with a couple of colleagues, one of whom is the former Secretary of State of Connecticut, arguing that secretaries of state should no longer be the chief electoral officer of a state, or if they are, the position shouldn't be an elected position. We want these people to be free of any partisan or other conflicts of interest. And as I'll explain further, we need stronger national standards for voter registration and voting in elections. And we need adequate funding for in support of states and counties to administer elections and to modernize their equipment. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but I will just say that we had a very close call in 2020 in many ways. Most people think of January 6th and the effort to invalidate and steal the election after. But we had a year-long close call in getting the states and counties ready to administer the election during a pandemic. And it was only the provision of more than $500 million of private philanthropic assistance to the states and counties to help them recruit the necessary poll workers and especially modernize and equipment and purchase new equipment that prevented disaster here. And we can't keep relying, and in no democracy for the administration of its public elections should be relying on private philanthropy to fill a gap that should be funded by the people, by the tax dollars. And of course, it was again one political party in the United States Congress that obstructed the effort to allocate what was really needed in the estimate of professionals like my colleague here at Stanford, Nate personally, to fill the gap, which was much closer to $2 billion. In any case, we have a big agenda ahead of us in terms of voting rights. The first imperative is to defend the voting right that we have managed to achieve. And this requires renewing the Voting Rights Act. I think it requires all the provisions as well in HR1, S1 that would prevent wholesale purges of the voter rolls and the imposition of voter ID laws that would impose a discriminatory burden on lower income voters. But we shouldn't stop there. Our goal should not only be to defend what we have, but to expand voting rights through automatic voter registration, extending voting rights for felons, at least when they've completed their terms. And of course, the great success of 2020 in the face of the pandemic. And let's bear in mind, we may be in a situation in 2022, not unlike what we faced in 2020 in terms of a pandemic that, you know, is getting recurrent momentum and represents a recurrent threat, particularly to older voters. So retaining and expanding voting by mail and early voting and voting that doesn't require people to stand in long lines or be closely clustered physically to one another, I think is very important. And then we need stronger standards for election security in terms of using only paper ballots, in my view, should be the standard, that could be optically scanned and then easily recounted. We definitely must avoid, and the organization I work with has been passionate in support of this, and it's mainly computer scientists who staff and lead the organization, verified voting. No vote should ever take place in any democracy, no vote of consequence that can't be verified with an audit or a recount. And so that requires a paper record of the ballots that can be recounted. I've said we should fully restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act. These are some of the, I think, obvious things we should be moving to, including same-day, like the motor voter bill. I'm coming to the belief that we should make voting compulsory. I think it would encourage moderation for reasons I can explain in the Q&A, and also remove the debate about who should be registered and how. But I think that's not a debate we can win. Days to vote and more mail-in voting. The idea that's been floating around for a long time of making voting a national holiday becomes less important, but I still favor it. And moving primary elections closer to the general election would, I think, increase voter participation in primary elections. And therefore, if you have more voter participation in primary elections, you're also going to have more moderation, because the lower the voter participation in a primary election, the more likely it is to be dominated by the highly motivated. And the highly motivated tend to be the ideological extremes. So how to reduce polarization? This is now the theme I'd like to come to. My basic message is, polarization is a big part of the dynamic that is slowly killing American democracy. I think it is not the sole reason for, but a major reason for the dynamic of growing distrust and defection from democratic norms. In any case, it's increasingly leading to congressional deadlock and stalemate, citizen disenchantment with our politics and more broadly with democracy. And it just has long been a factor in making democracy less functional, less democratic, and more dominated by militant, extreme, and uncompromising elements. The polarizing formula in our democracy today has the following elements: a two-party dominant system that worked certainly well enough for about 150 years, but now has really become, I think, a stagnant and counterproductive duopoly that's freezing competition and is unfair and unhealthy. The nomination of candidates in low turnout primary elections, which, as tends to favor more militant and extreme candidates. The denial of ballot for who lose in priority militants, they can't come back and run as independents. That's called the sore loser rule. And an electoral system that we came to take for granted over these 230 years of conducting elections under our constitutional system, what we call first past the post. You have candidates elected from single member districts in the House, Senate, state legislatures. Whoever gets the most votes wins. But in fact, that is not the way most countries in the world elect their state or national legislatures. And it's an electoral system that has increasingly been abandoned by democracies in the spirit of reform. So it's a dwindling number of mainly former British colonies and Britain itself that use this system to elect their parliaments or national assemblies. And more countries are going to different methods. And of course, there's the social media element that I'll be glad to answer questions about, but I just don't have the scope in this lecture to address. This is my reform agenda, and I'll be glad to answer questions about some elements of it that I'm not going to be able to address here. In the Q&A, I'll just see how far I can get. But number one for me is ranked choice voting. I think this is the reform that has the best prospect of reducing polarization and invigorating democracy by allowing more choice, more open competition, and a chance for other alternatives outside the main two parties to at least get a hearing and at least be able to be seriously considered in the competition. I've spoken about many of these. I'm not going to speak about eliminating the Electoral College, except to say, I think it's an abomination. I think it's undemocratic. For most of our history, it has not worked in anything like the way that our founding framers of the Constitution intended. It isn't going to be eliminated by constitutional amendment because we'll never achieve the threshold for that in my lifetime and probably not in your lifetimes. And so the only chance we've got is the National Popular Vote Compact, which many of you are aware of, but I don't think we can get it adopted in the near term in a sufficient number of states to activate it. I hope to get to the Supreme Court before I end, and let's just see how far I can get in this agenda. One goal of electoral reform should be to reduce the disproportionate influence of highly ideologically committed voters in low turnout primary elections. I maintain that the single most important cause of our polarizing sickness in our democracy today is the interaction between our general election method of choosing executives and legislators in first past the post elections, whoever gets the most votes wins, and our primary method of nominating candidates in low turnout party primaries, usually, as in California, 5-6 months before the general election, when most people aren't paying attention. Some states have moved to open primaries. Anybody can vote in any party primary, but they seem to have little effect on this process. And so I think that the most interesting reforms involve ranked choice voting. I'll say more about it in a minute, either in single member districts or multi-member districts, and elimination of the sore loser rule so moderate incumbents can survive losing a party primary and run as independents if it comes to that in a general election, or the alternative, which we have in California, a nonpartisan blanket primary. But the most important thing about all of this that I want to say to you as fellow Californians is, I don't think the system we adopted, even though I voted for it because I thought it was better than what we had, of top two, is doing very much to invigorate democracy or reduce political polarization in California. I think there's been a modest positive effect, but only modest. And I'm very intrigued by the reform that was adopted as a result of a voter initiative in Alaska in November 2020, which is top four. And I'm going to say more about that. Top four, a blanket primary, and ranked choice voting to choose the winners. I think by now, with ranked choice voting gaining momentum in the United States, having been adopted by many Bay Area cities, including Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, San Leandro, you know how it works. there are multiple candidates usually running, and you can rank your choices 1, 2, 3, 4. Or in New York, people could vote for up to 5 candidates in the New York Democratic primary. And if your first choice doesn't make it and nobody gets a majority of first preference votes, then the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is eliminated. And his or her votes are redistributed to the voters' second choices. And you get a series of instant runoffs until somebody emerges with a majority of the vote, or at least a majority of the remaining votes that are being redistributed. And as you can see here, that isn't always necessarily the candidate who finished first in round 1. Maybe there's a candidate who finishes back a bit, but tends to be everybody's second choice. Now, this is how Catherine Garcia came close to winning the New York City Democratic mayoral primary in New York. She was a lot of people's second preference. But in any case, you can see how the dynamic works here. The appeal of ranked choice voting, I think, is most of all for me that it tends to make it hard for more extremist and militant candidates to win by only appealing to a third of the electorate, but or 40% or something, or even 25% in a party primary, but then prevailing because they get more votes than anybody else. So if you have to win a majority of votes through the vote transfer process, it requires you to appeal to a broader array of the voting public. And it really penalizes negative campaigning, because it's very hard to go negative against multiple alternatives at once. If it's a two-person contest, there's really, in the end, only 2 candidates who matter. It tends to be a destruction derby in which whoever goes most viciously negative wins, because people may wind up despising the person who's gone negative, but a lot of research and campaign experience shows that they'll despise the rival that candidate went negative against even more. But if there are multiple candidates, then the person who goes negative winds up doing him or herself in. And so we find in the cities that have been using ranked choice voting that election campaigns are less expensive and voters perceive them to be less negative, because they are less negative, because it's harder to go negative, and it tends to it tends to encourage coalition formation and appeals to broader coalitions and interests. It also ends the spoiler problem, because you don't have to worry that if you want to vote for the Green Party, or you want to vote for the Libertarian Party, or there's an independent or a quirky candidate who appeals to you, but if you vote for them, you may be wasting your vote and helping to elect the candidate you most don't want, what I call the Ralph Nader problem, because Nader proved to be a spoiler in Florida, and that, a lot of people on the left feel elected George W. Bush president. If there'd been ranked choice voting in Florida for the presidential election in 2000, Al Gore would have been elected president. But it's not only Democrats who will gain. There will be some instances where, a moderate Republican may wind up winning if a Democrat, winds up being too far to the left to be able to really appeal broadly. And so ranked choice voting, a growing number of political scientists feel, will both reduce political polarization and be more democratic by giving voters more choice, by enabling more political competition, and by ensuring that the person who wins has majority support. Now then, how do we do ranked choice voting? We reach a fork in the road where I think there are two options. One option is to continue with our party primaries. And I would favor using ranked choice voting in the party primaries. And whoever gets, whoever is able to get through the vote transfers in a party primary, majority support in the primary, they then face off against one another in a general election. But if we go that route, I favor ending the sore loser rule, which still applies in about 44 or 45 states, that says if you lose a party primary, you can't get on the ballot in the general election, because that would enable some moderates, in this case, more likely moderate Republicans, who've been trumped by the extremist wing of the party, to come back and offer themselves as an alternative. And they do that with ranked choice voting, and it might make for a very interesting outcome. Another electoral option would be to use ranked choice voting with proportional representation in small multi-member districts. There is a bill in the Senate that would do this, and it has no chance of passing. But I will note it would address this disproportionality problem that we now have with gerrymandering, where, for example, Democrats win a third of the vote in Alabama, but only get 1 of 7 seats in the Congress. Republicans get 36% of the vote in Connecticut, but get none of the 5 congressional seats. If you had ranked choice voting with proportional representation in Connecticut, and it was a single 5-member district, instead of getting no seats, Republicans would probably get 2 seats, or at least 1 seat, and that would be a fair distribution. And instead of Democrats getting 3 seats in North Carolina out of 13, they'd probably get 6. So that's what the Fair Representation Act would do. And there are a number of arguments for proportional representation that are made around the world in terms of making democracy more inclusive of women and minorities, of fair representation of partisan minorities, reducing the influence of gerrymandering, and so on. I've got some reasons to give me pause about ranked choice voting, but in any case, I'm going to skip over those cautions about proportional representation, but I'm going to skip over those now. Ranked choice voting is gaining momentum. I think it won by voter referendum in Maine twice, when the politicians tried to stab the first voter initiative in the back and kill it. The voters gathered signatures again and restored it. And it lost in Massachusetts in November. Many of us thought it would win, but it won in Alaska with this top 4 system. It's now been adopted in the largest jurisdiction ever in the United States, in New York City, just very recently in June for their mayoral race, and seemed to work pretty well. Of course, it's used in many cities. Referendums are probably going to be the way that ranked choice voting may get adopted. You can see that other reforms, for example, to terminate gerrymandering, have not only been winning in Democratic-leaning states like Colorado and Michigan, but also in Republican-leaning states like Missouri, Ohio, and Utah. Advocates of ranked choice voting actually have their eyes on these 3 latter states as states that someday might be receptive to a voter initiative for ranked choice voting, just on the grounds of giving voters more control, more choice, and creating more competition, more healthy competition. Other state initiatives recently have eliminated gerrymandering in some states. And as in Oregon, have reformed campaign finance. And I think you know some of the other reforms in HR1, the For the People Act, that would involve multiple matching of small donors. I could comment more on that. There is a concern I have about that that's a bit counterintuitive that I can share with you. And radical transparency in campaign finance, which I strongly favor. And then, of course, ethics reform. Our ethics laws are fragmented and a mess. All you have to do is utter the word Donald Trump to understand why. We need to strengthen our conflict of interest laws. We need to require presidential candidates and presidents to disclose pretty substantial backlog of their income tax returns. And we need to strengthen laws on lobbying, on foreign agent registration, and on government ethics more broadly. I've spoken about electoral integrity briefly on the Congress. I think that we could diminish polarization by giving the minority in each house a little bit more power to influence legislation rather than make them purely a captive of the majority party leader. Nancy Pelosi went a little bit of the way toward doing this in a deal with the House Problem Solvers Caucus after the 2018 election. Obviously, I favor getting rid of the filibuster, or at least to make it, as Norm Ornstein has proposed, a talking filibuster. Many of us will recall that's the way it used to be, where you had to take and hold the Senate floor in order to block legislation. And I would, if we can't get rid of the filibuster, I'd see if we could get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to agree to a talking filibuster and maybe a lower threshold for cloture of 55 instead of 60 seats. Finally, I want to talk about the Supreme Court. I think we really need to reform the Supreme Court. A lot of the unfairness in the Supreme Court today is, accidents of history that have enabled Republicans to name since 1976, 11 of the 15 justices of the Supreme Court that have been nominated during this process, even though they've only had a slight advantage over Democrats in the number of years they've controlled the White House. But I think that, we shouldn't have people serving on the court for 25, 30 years. No other advanced democracy has lifetime unlimited appointments. They either have an age limit of roughly 70 years, sometimes lower, or they have a term limit, which is, often just 10, 12 years, something like that. I actually strongly favor the bill that Ro Khanna has introduced into the US House, which has essentially been endorsed by The Economist magazine, which would nominate justices for fixed terms of 18 years. And after that, they could continue on the federal bench. Each president would then be able to nominate a new justice in the first and third years of his or her presidential term. And this would avoid election year fights. It would ensure that each president in a 4-year term would get 2 nominations. And there'd be no more monkey business like Mitch McConnell intervened with to block the nomination of Merrick Garland. Under this bill, the Senate would have a reasonable amount of time, I think 120 days, to act on a presidential nomination. And if they didn't act on it, the president's nominee would automatically be confirmed. This leaves open the question of what you do with the sitting justices. I would prefer to retire them after 18 years, but I don't think that is politically and maybe not constitutionally feasible. So, this bill would wind up temporarily expanding the size of the Supreme Court until, such time as the number of justices came down back to 9 through retirements. I'll just close by saying we really need to renew a sense of patriotism and civic commitment in our democracy. I share this quote with you from Sidney Hook, and this means reviving civic education in the United States and a commitment to our democratic norms. I'm going to stop there because I want to take your questions. So I now come to Myra to do that.
Thank you so much. The chat is very, very active. So people really have listened carefully, and you've given us a tremendous amount of information to ponder and think about. So I will try to get through as many as I can. There's quite a lot in the chat as well as Q&A. So let's start with, please comment on the Chinese model of development and its future potential for becoming a democracy.
Well, the Chinese model is one that the People's Republic of China is certainly pushing hard right now, globally. And, they claim it's the superior model to Western democracy. We aren't doing much to advance the global cause of democracy when our own democracy is malfunctioning as badly as I think ours is. In the near term, even in the near term, I don't think it's much of a model. I've been engaged in a program now, engaging African journalists and civil society leaders about China's role in Africa and so on. I look at the survey data very closely. People around the world want the Chinese model of rapid economic growth, but they don't want the Chinese model of neo-totalitarian information control and monitoring of citizens and suppression of freedom of speech and other human rights. But we've got to do more to defend and promote democracy globally, and we've got to do more to renew our own democracy as a model that is, at least in general terms, worth emulating. I do believe that China will experience growing internal pressure for democratic reform and for human rights, both as the country becomes more globalized and more educated, and as the Chinese system runs into, I think, what are going to be some inevitable problems of economic performance, economic contradictions, social frustration, and so on. But I don't have the time to elaborate on that here. And it's not a straight linear process. Right now, China's been moving backwards, and its effort to propagandize and intimidate its population is enjoying some short-term success.
Thank you. The next question is there any chance other states are moving in the direction of the Secretary of State having less power?
I don't think so yet. At this point, it's kind of more a gleam in the eye of reformers. But I think that, what we need is a nationally coordinated reform campaign. The League of Women Voters would be a good organization to push it, to have just a standard model. Hey, let's make elections a professional, neutral, civil service responsibility, like it is in most other democracies, virtually all other democracies around the world. And, some people said, when we had the opportunity to eliminate gerrymandering in California, why should California do this, give up the advantage for the Democratic Party of gerrymandering California if Texas doesn't do it as well. It's kind of unilateral disarmament. And I think there are some respects in which you've just got to be the first mover and do the right thing and generate momentum for other states to move in that direction. And I think that we lose nothing in democratically dominated states by giving the power to administer elections to a highly competent professional staff, because, you know, in those states, Democrats will do just fine, and elections will be administered, in fact, in the same way they would have otherwise, but they'll be more superficially credible. And that will then generate pressure on Republican-controlled states to follow suit.
Thank you. The next one is, can the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact work while each state controls their own elections and vote counts?
Well, it can if the states vote for it. Keep in mind what the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is. It's a network of coordinated efforts across states to adopt identical legislation that mandate that their state's electoral votes will be cast for the winner of the national popular vote and not necessarily the winner of the popular vote in their states. So, you know, if states, and that this will come into effect when states that account for a majority of the electoral votes, namely 270, have passed this identical legislation. If the states do this, then, you know, that would really be great because it diminishes the stakes in a state election. You know, Georgia's Republican Party, you know, has much less incentive to manipulate their state's vote if it's the national popular vote that's determined the presidential winner. Georgia, in that case, in a closely fought election, isn't potentially going to flip the national outcome one way or the other. So the challenge there is not that states may be continuing to engage in the shenanigans they're engaging in to control the vote outcome. I don't think that's would be likely to be decisive on a national level. The challenge is getting states that account for 270 electoral votes to adopt this legislation. And right now, I think we're about 95 electoral votes short, and it's hard to see at the moment where the math is to get to 270. But I think it's a cause we should, you know, continue to work on.
Okay, the next one is, do we need to be concerned about efforts to rewrite the Constitution via constitutional convention? Common Cause has warned about this.
Yes, I think it would be a calamitously bad idea, because then everything would be opened up. And, you know, there's a lot of research dating back quite some time now to suggest that if we had a new constitutional convention, people wouldn't be as ready to affirm the Bill of Rights and particularly freedom of expression as they are now. And, you know, it would be a horrible and dangerous crapshoot. And some people might think, well, we could do it and we'd get rid of the Second Amendment or modify it to enable us to get some gun safety legislation. But, you know, the way the country's going now, I think you'd be much more likely to see, one, the likeliest outcome would be absolute paralysis and a deepening of our polarization, or two, a constitution that would be even worse than the one we have now. And the one we have now, I think, has some major defects. So I think there's so much, Myra, that we can do to improve the functioning of our democracy through plausible legislation and through the kinds of grassroots, bottom-up reform initiatives that we had a century ago with the progressive movement in the United States, and I'll repeat, the women's suffrage movement. That's what I favor. Grassroots initiatives at the state level and coordinated efforts perhaps for national legislation that would improve the functioning of our democracy. And maybe someday, you know, if we can, if the stars align politically, very selective constitutional amendments to repair some of the defects. But I think there's so much we can do legislatively that's where our focus should be now.
Can you please talk about the problems New York had with ranked choice voting and voter confusion? How might that proactively be avoided in the future?
Well, I think some of it was just pure administration of the vote. And I think that a better preparation and organization of the logistics of voting would help here. But you know, whenever you introduce a change like this, it does have a learning curve. And so I think voters went through a learning curve in New York City. But I think the near-term feedback is indicating that people in the end liked the concept, they liked the choice. And I think the public opinion surveys will show that, and that the New York City electoral administration infrastructure will learn from some of their mistakes, and next time will go better. And hopefully it will be adopted in other jurisdictions and even at the state level in New York.
The next is, I'm not convinced that many very conservative evangelicals have the same commitment, if any, to democratic principles, but instead principles expressed in the Bible. Are we trying to bring many people back to practices that are in opposition to these people's core beliefs?
Well, I think the problem of beliefs and anxieties is very much central to the crisis of our democracy today, to the conundrum we are in. I want to caution against stereotyping people. I think a lot of evangelical Christians don't agree with the radical right agenda and the anti-democratic agenda of the political party, the Republican Party, that the majority of evangelicals in the United States now typically vote for. So let's not put everyone in one box. Let's also remember that many of the people who are driving the Republican authoritarian power agenda, the Trumpist agenda of attempting to steal an election, or steal elections, I should say, are hardly themselves the least bit religious, starting with Donald Trump. I'll leave it at that. But we do have a problem of eroding commitment to democratic norms. And I think we face a huge challenge in addressing that problem. And I think it's going to require a new generation of civic education. I think it's going to require interfaith dialogues. I think it's going to require efforts to bridge some of our social divides. We have a lot of work to do, and it's not all in the realm of electoral or institutional or congressional politics. Our society is deeply riven And we all need to think about how we can take initiatives to bridge divides, break out of filter bubbles, and engage our fellow citizens of widely divergent views in a mutually respectful fashion.
There have been a few questions that came in prior that I haven't had a chance, and we've got maybe time for one more question, and then I'd like to keep everybody on for just a few minutes to wrap up. But there's conversation amongst particularly the League of Women Voters and people who are extremely active and concerned about everything you've talked about today. And what do you have to suggest to act locally to repair American democracy? What are some of the really grassroots things that we as individuals can do to have an impact?
Well, I would say number one, of course, inform yourselves, support national organizations that are working on these issues to defend voting rights and empower and reform democracy. I think that in a community like Palo Alto, it would be very good to start a dialogue with the community in Texas or Alabama that has a different set of views. My colleague at Stanford, James Fishkin, and I have a project called America in One Room to try and gather a random sample of the American public to come together, as we did gather them in Dallas, Texas, in September of 2019 to talk about the issues in a safe and mutually respectful environment with careful moderation of the discussions and balanced views of experts and objective and balanced briefing papers on the issues. And we achieved quite dramatic reductions in the kind of emotive polarization between Democrats and Republicans through that experience. Since then, we did an experiment in the schools where it worked very well. And we're now going to do a deliberative poll on climate change that will bring together a national random sample, but will oversample people from California and Texas to engage in this dialogue and see if there's any possibility for Americans to find common ground on what is the most important and existential issue facing us all, again, climate change. So I think that if you're thinking locally, beyond the effort to model good behavior and develop programs of awareness and civic education and all of that, I'd say reach out to another part of the country that's very different from the Palo Alto bubble and see if you can start a conversation. And maybe in doing that, that will model something that can be reproduced hundreds of times so that we can begin to understand one another and hear one another rather than demonize one another.
Thank you for that. We actually have an event on the calendar for early next year to do one of those in one room kind of activities, but beyond our state would be something that would be a bigger opportunity. So we will give that a lot of thought. It's our passion. Democracy is what we stand for at the League of Women Voters. And so I want to just wrap up and thank you so much, Dr. Diamond, for spending time with us today and giving us your insights, your incredible insights into what's going on in our country and the world, and opportunities for change, both locally and nationwide. I also want to thank our co-sponsors today, Congregation Beth Am and the AAUW of Palo Alto. I appreciate your interest and involvement, as well as our sister leagues, and hope that many of your members have joined us today. Just want to give a quick shout out to my committee, which behind the scenes is always working very hard to bring these events to you. Louise Valentes, who's our Zoom master, has been running everything in the background here, and also to Karen Kalinsky and Lisa Vogt-Levin. Thank you for all of your help in putting these events together. There'll be a video recording. I know we've had several questions about that along the way. So it will be up on our website soon. I don't know the exact timing, but check in a few days to see if you are interested in taking a look at this again or sharing it with friends. I know a lot of times people just want to have another chance to digest all the information. We also will be sending out a SurveyMonkey to all of you and encourage you to fill that out. It's very short, easy, quick, and we appreciate your feedback in terms of this event and future events that you're interested in having, as well as comments on the potential of an in-person winter luncheon, as pre-pandemic has been the tradition of the League of Women Voters in Palo Alto. The next newsletter will be back in the middle of the month to keep you updated on League of Women Voters events and news, both nationally and locally. So again, thank you all of our participants. Thank you, Dr. Diamond, for your time today and all of your great information that you shared with us. And I think that is a wrap. Signing off, and thanks again.
Okay.
And stopping the recording.